So for this video, I'm going to be going through each of the blue spells in Artifact, and I'm going to talk about which ones are seeing play, which ones are not, which modes they're seeing play in, whether it's constructed or draft, and if they're not seeing play, let's talk about, why is that the case, what would need to happen for them to be good, if they are seeing play, what makes them good, and, why are they potentially only good right now, that sort of thing. And for the most part, I don't do like point systems or 4 out of 5 star ratings or anything like that. I think that the discussion is more important, and then I just let you, with the knowledge, with the education of what was discussed in this video, I let you make your own decisions on whether or not you want to play a specific card and in what situations. So, now that we got that out of the way, let's just go ahead and start plowing through these cards because there is an awful lot of blue spells in Artifact. And we begin with Diabolic Revelation. This is a 1 mana spell. You draw 2 cards, but you deal 2 damage to all allies in all lanes. And that has the potential to be a pretty hefty drawback, but this does see play. It sees play in Constructed, famously in the Salamene Storm deck, the blue-green combo deck, because you can turn that negative into a positive, and you can use this to activate really impactful Prey on the Weak plays. That is Canna's signature spell, signature card. The draw 2 cards is also great, and doing so at only 1 mana makes it even playable in the non-combo decks. I've seen it in mono blue a couple of times, and I've seen it in a couple of other decks as well, because if you need to find an answer, and you also need to then have the mana left over to play the answer when you find it, spending 1 mana to dig 2 cards deeper is pretty powerful. This is 2 damage, not piercing damage. So I've also seen this in a couple of the like blue-red controlling variants, because if you've got like a Bristleback who's already got the armor buff, or you have Axe or similar heroes, they're not going to take damage from this, and so you're really only wounding your creeps at that point. So it does see play. I have even seen it played in certain draft decks, though when you're drafting, this isn't the sort of card that you put in any draft deck. You have to have cards that either mitigate the drawback or take advantage of it, like if you've drafted Canna, in which case you might consider putting it in, but this is not the kind of card that you pick early and often in a draft, and it's certainly not the card that you just shove in any of your blue drafts. You want to be able to take advantage of it in some fashion. So Diabolic Revelation is good because drawing cards is good, and it is good because there's a number of cards with a decent enough synergy, or at a minimum, way to minimize the potential drawback. Next up, we have Strafing Run. This is 1 mana, and it deals 2 damage to each enemy creep. Now, this is only the creeps that are in the lane where you play this, and it's worth noting that 2 damage is not enough by itself to kill an enemy creep. So this, for the most part, just kills wounded creeps. I think I overvalued this when I started playing the game in the closed beta, because I felt like, 1 mana for an AoE effect, even if it wasn't going to be enough to kill creeps, I just felt like there was a high level of potential there, but in practice, this just feels really weak. It does not remove things unless they've already taken damage, and it takes a lot of setup, and yes, it's only 1 mana, but even if you're spending 1 mana and a card, and then you're not getting something crazy impactful in return, it can just feel really bad. I've played this a couple of times as like a one-of in draft, but I do not play it in Constructed, and honestly, it's been a long time since I've seen anybody play it in Constructed. There was a few of us experimenting with it in the closed beta, but the cost of just spending a card for such a low impact ability is not worth it in Constructed. And again, I've said this in some of the other review videos, it's worth noting that you only have like 25 slots in your Constructed deck, and so if the cards that you're including in your Constructed deck aren't like really good or helping with some sort of synergy or game plan, they're probably just not worth the slot. So that's the case here with Strafing Run. Next up, we have Ventriloquy, I'm gonna slaughter this. I never get it right. I actually just call it Vent for short because I never get it right. But the card is 1 mana, and you choose a unit, and it taunts. This actually is decent in draft. It does not see a lot of play in constructed, but in draft, this can be a pretty nifty combat trick because you can choose allied units and make enemies attack your like melee creep, for example, and prevent one of your heroes from dying. Or on the other side of the fence, if you want, you could make the enemy hero taunt and then have all of your units, you know, curve in or arrow in to attack the enemy hero and potentially take that out. You know, for 1 mana, it provides a lot of utility. It's a nifty trick, so it's not terrible. You know, you're not going to draft it early or often in a pack, but you don't feel bad if you have to run one. You don't want to just draft all of them, right? Like, you don't want a scenario where you're running 4 of these, but, you know, as a filler card, you throw one in, you don't feel too bad. Cunning Plan. 2 mana, swap a unit with one of its allied neighbors, draw a card. This card does see play in constructed, and I'm typically happy when I play it in draft as well. For the same reason that yeah, I'm still gonna slaughter that, right? So the same reason that Vent sees play in draft, this is like a better version of this, which is why it sees play in constructed and in draft. And the reason it's better is because it's a similar level of utility. It's not the exact same effect, but it is a combat trick. You can use it to save your heroes. You can use it to potentially threaten enemy heroes, things like that. But it also cycles. It draws a card. So your net investment in this is really only 1 mana more, but you replace the card, and that's a pretty big deal. So Cunning Plan sees play in constructed, sees play in draft. You know, again, in draft, cards like this are good and they see play, but it doesn't have like a huge impact on the board, so you're not going to like first pick this in a pack unless that pack is just absolutely utter garbage. But, you know, you don't feel bad if you have to run them. Next up is Lightning Strike. This is a card I tried to make work in the closed beta. I tried some pretty aggressive decks, and I also tried some pretty memey things like trying to use Ogre Magi and Lightning Strike so I could just spam Lightning Strike over and over and over again. Not consistent. Overall, not quite good enough for constructed play. But you can be pretty sneaky with even just including it as a one-of in your draft, because 6 damage is a healthy amount of damage, and it's a burst damage. And the real interesting thing is that in games where things might be very, very close, and your opponent might even be trying to play for a draw, you can potentially nuke their tower before they ever get a chance to respond or do anything, and then kind of steal a game. But the reach is nice. I don't think you want a lot of these. As good as it is, I think I would much rather have creeps most of the time, because there's just more versatility and utility in creeps. Creeps, in theory, represent damage on a tower, but they also represent the ability to soak damage from your opponent and stall out a game, whereas this is a one-sided, you know, like one-time effect that is just damage and cannot soak. And it's a one-time use, where a creep, if you play it and it survives, can give you recurring value. So, you know, in terms of draft, you don't want to draft a lot of these if you can help it. You'd still rather draft creeps. You'd rather draft things like, you know, Dimensional Portal, which we'll get to in a bit. But if you have to run one, it's not the end of the world. Whispers of Madness. 2 mana, stun an enemy this round, and stun allied heroes in all lanes this round. This card's just not good. If you stun all of your heroes in all lanes, then you're not playing cards anymore unless you use something like Jasper Daggers to remove the stun afterwards. But even then, like, that is a huge drawback. Like, compared to the drawback on Diabolic Revelation, this is a huge drawback to just stun one unit. That being said, in the closed beta, there was this like randomized mode where you would literally just get a randomized deck, and sometimes you could use this in the 3rd lane to do some cheeky things, because if you're in the 3rd lane, it doesn't matter if your heroes in the 1st lane and the 2nd lane get stunned. And if you're just trying to prevent your opponent from doing something and you kind of don't care about playing cards yourself in the third lane, then yeah, 2 mana, stun an enemy hero and, you know, prevent them from developing their board or something. Maybe. But it's such like a rare and like niche scenario that like putting this purposefully in any deck, whether it's constructed or draft, for that like really weird one-off scenario just doesn't seem good, and it's not good. Now in the future, if they ever you know, print something based on the number of stunned heroes you have or something, and then you get some amazing effect, you might consider this, but right now it's pretty bad. Next up we have At Any Cost. This card is very good. It's very good in constructed, it's very good in draft. You would probably high pick this in draft because AoE board sweeps are not very prevalent in draft, and the ones that are good are rare like this, so you want to pick them up when you have the opportunity. The reason this is good is because it, even if it does not kill heroes, will kill almost all of the creeps on somebody's board, and at the cost that this costs mana wise, you're really using this to help deter very, very aggressive decks, and really you're trying to use this to slow down somebody who has a very fast early game. This is the kind of card, for example, that keeps red and black aggro decks in check, or you know, black based decks that are based on the Oath, for example, or swarm decks based on Dimensional Portal, or things like that. This card early on is like a mini Annihilation. Again, even if you don't kill all of the heroes, if somebody tries to go wide and play a lot of creeps very early and very often, this can bail you out. It is a very effective card. It's like I said, good in constructed, good in draft, and as long as aggressive decks are around, it will be popular. Now, if we ever transition to a more mid-rangey meta, a more like late game meta, something like that, maybe if it's just like a more ramp dominated meta, then this becomes far less popular, because in those instances where the size of the heroes and the size of the creeps are that much larger, then this loses its impact. But as long as there are aggressive decks around, At Any Cost will be good. Next up we have Better Late Than Never. I like to jokingly in draft call this the Better a Body Than Nothing. So it's a 3 mana spell. You summon a melee creep into any lane, so it is cross lane playable. It does not typically see play in constructed, though if you've seen my YouTube channel, I have one blue-black aggro deck where I've been experimenting with it because it allows you to put creeps into a lane where you've already played the Oath. So the idea is when you play the Oath in your Oath lane, you can use your mana to play improvements, but in your non-Oath lanes, you can use cards like Better Late Than Never to put creeps into your Oath lane to speed up the clock. So that's like the only time I've ever seen it played in constructed, and I'm not even convinced it's correct. I'm just experimenting with it. Outside of that, it's just not good enough. But in draft, the truth is blue just doesn't have a lot of creeps, and sometimes you just need bodies, and so if you need a filler card, it's better to have a body than not, in my opinion. And the fact that this is a cross lane playable card means that even if blue is your splash color, for example, you only have one blue hero, then this opens up some versatility. So you know, if you play this in draft, it's not the end of the world. You're certainly not like trying to actively pick this very often, but it is a okay filler card in draft. Next up we have Buying Time. 3 mana, give 2 random cards in opponent's hand lock. And if you're not familiar, cards with lock cannot be played as long as they are locked, and their lock value is a duration in rounds, and at the beginning of each round, or excuse me, at the end of each round it goes down by 1. So you play Buying Time, and you lock 2 random cards in your opponent's hand for 2 rounds essentially, and then they can't play them until 2 rounds from now. I've seen this experimented with a lot, both this and some of the other lock cards that we might see later on. In the closed beta, there were some like control decks that were trying to use board sweeps like At Any Cost and Annihilation, and then cards like Buying Time, the Hourglass item, some other cards as well that have lock, to just stall out the game. There are some cards that are more effective than others. We'll get to it in a little bit, but like Lost in Time is actually pretty powerful in certain things, but Buying Time is only like okay. It doesn't really see playing constructed anymore. After the like round of experimentation in the closed beta, I think most people kind of figured out that the investment of mana to only delay things, like you're not impacting the board, you're not dealing with your opponent's existing board, you're just kind of making it so that they don't play things, and you're doing so in a color that you traditionally kind of want them to play things, so you can blow them all up, right, and gain card advantage in that regard. So it just doesn't see playing constructed. I've seen it played as a filler card a couple of times in draft. I think this is more of like a personal preference thing. I personally don't like it in draft because again, it doesn't impact the board, it doesn't do much for your fundamentals, but you know, some people do like it. It is the kind of card that you want to keep an eye on, because if we see other cards printed in the future that take advantage of lock, right? We could see cards that deal damage based on the number of locked cards in the enemy's hand. We could see heroes that get passive or active benefits from cards that are locked, so on and so forth. Then yeah, you'll revisit Buying Time and you'll think about including it. But right now it's at best a filler card, and it's typically a personal preference thing. So next up we have Compel. This is 3 mana, choose a unit, choose a combat target for it, draw a card. So this is very similar to and in the same vein of the Cunning Plan that we saw earlier. The difference is that this one does not swap positions. This one just lets you pick combat targets. So you can make the enemy target your melee creep instead of your hero. You can make your hero target an enemy hero instead of their melee creep. If you catch a bad arrow and you wanted to hit an enemy tower, but unfortunately something was curving, you can use Compel to retarget the tower. It's just a good utility tool, and the fact that it cycles, much like Cunning Plan, does mean that this sees play. It sees a lot of play in Constructed and in Draft. Constructed, it's typically in mono blue and some of the other combo decks that want it for the draw card to cycle. All these cycle cards are great for combo decks because they let you dig through your deck that much faster. But yeah, it sees play in both modes. Good utility. Enough said. Next we have Rolling Storm. This is a card that deals 2 damage to all towers in all lanes. And it's important to note that it really is all towers, so don't accidentally kill yourself with this. But yeah, I mean, 2 damage to all towers in all lanes. I don't think I've ever seen this played. Like, even in Draft, I don't think I've ever had it played against me. I'm sure somebody at one point has had it in their deck, and then maybe they just never ended up playing it. But 2 damage is such a small amount of damage to deal to a tower. And granted, you're technically dealing like 6 because it's 2 to each of your enemy towers, but in most games you care about 2 towers, and sometimes only even 1 if you're trying to go for an ancient kill. So really this is like, you know, pay 3 to deal 4 damage, and it's spread out, and it doesn't cycle, it doesn't do anything else, doesn't impact the board. It's just a low impact play, and as such it just does not see play in Constructed or Draft. Next up we have Tower Barrage. This is like Strafing Run, but on steroids. This deals 2 damage to each enemy, so this hits heroes, not just creeps. But the drawback is this costs 3 instead of 1. Much like Strafing Run, this can sometimes end up being a filler card in your draft. Not strong enough to see play in Constructed because 2 damage is just not high enough. Maybe if this was piercing damage, it might start seeing play, but there's too many easy ways to mitigate this, and it doesn't kill anything by itself. It still needs some help, it needs some setup. So, you know, everything I said about Strafing Run, just apply it here, and we'll move on. Alright, Wrath of Gold. This is 3 mana. You spend all of your gold, so whatever gold you have, you just spend it, right? You got 8 gold, you spend 8 gold. You got 50 gold, you spend 50 gold, whatever the case may be. And then you repeat 1 time for each gold spent, deal 4 damage to a random ally or enemy. This card, I have seen it played in draft. I'm not convinced it was the right thing to do in said draft, but I have seen it played against me in draft. Never seen this played in constructed, and well, I guess I can't say never. I'm sure I've probably seen it, but my memory has suppressed it. I'll put it that way. This card is just not very good because you are spending all of your gold and then you get a random output, a random effect. So even if you spend like 8 gold, right? 8 times 4 is 32. You can do 32 damage to the board. But it's going to potentially nuke your stuff as much as your opponent's. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we do run cards like At Any Cost and Annihilation, and those self-nuke. So you can live with that. But it's not piercing damage, so armor can be a problem. If somebody even just has like an axe out, then that's going to reduce all damage done by this by half every time it hits axe. And if it just keeps hitting axe, because again, the targets are randomized, this might end up being pretty terrible. But also, because it uses gold, you force yourself into this weird position where if you are running this in your deck, you have to decide, do I want to save my gold to use for Wrath of Gold, or do I want to spend my gold on items to help me now? And a lot of times that just is a really bad position to be in, because if you're not buying items, then you're not giving yourself long-term value. And also, if you're spending your gold then on this, then you can't turn around and buy the items again unless your Wrath of Gold is very, very profitable for you. You know, there is sometimes the potential for Wrath of Gold to get you your gold back, if you will, based on the number of things that it kills or takes out. But it's always a risk, it's always a gamble. And if this was piercing damage, I would actually consider testing with it further in constructed. But the amount of setup and the cost, if you will, because the thing about Artifact is your resources in a game are not just like mana or gold or whatever. You got a lot of different resources, but the cost of this card is coming from both gold and mana, and the reward that you get for spending those resources is just too small, in my opinion, and too inconsistent, and that's why you don't see it get played. Alright, so we have and one for me. 4 mana, choose a hero, put a base copy of a random item equipped by that hero into your hand. So some things to note. 1, it is a random item, so if it's a hero that has like 3 items on it and they have 1 sweet item and 2, you know, Traveler's Cloaks, you could end up getting a cloak. But if they only have 1 item, then you always know exactly what item you're getting. Another thing to note is this is any hero. It's just choose a hero. So there has been some really fun times in draft, for example, where my opponent got something really cool from the secret shop, and then I got something really cool from their secret shop by just copying it. You know, if your opponent drops, you know, a Helm of the Dominator or something, and then you just copy it, now you're going to be able to steal whatever they stole. You know, if they have a Horn of the Alpha, now you have a Horn of the Alpha, that sort of thing. So it is kind of cheeky and fun. It does see play. Not necessarily at the highest levels of play, not like ultra competitive, but in the economy decks specifically, there's like a blue-black economy, like gold gain based control deck. This is ran because it can make copies of Horn or copies of Vesture, and once it starts making copies of Vesture, it gets really, really hard to kill that deck. So it does see play in constructed, at least in that build. Does see play in draft because, you know, again, it's you're spending mana, but you're spending mana to get a long-term buff of some kind in the form of, you know, copying an item that you can put on one of your heroes. So, yeah, it does see play. It's not like ultra impactful in draft unless either you high roll or your opponent high rolls. A lot of times this is, you know, just getting you like an extra Stonehall cloak or something. But sometimes that's good enough. And so, you know, it's worthy of an inclusion in a lot of cases. You don't pick it high. but it's okay if you run it. Next up we have Arcane Assault. This is 4 mana, deal 2 damage to the enemy tower, draw a card, get initiative. This card is actually pretty amazing because you're okay with everything it does. 2 damage to the enemy tower, I mean, it's not a lot to write home about, but it's better than nothing. But the fact that it cycles, because it draws a card, is great. And the get initiative is huge, specifically in blue decks, and specifically in decks that want to be like combo oriented. This is like a mainstay in a number of decks because it cycles, because it gives initiative. It definitely sees play in Constructed. If I have the opportunity, I like to try to run 1 or 2 in draft if I'm playing blue, just because of the initiative. Again, like if you can take initiative and then turn that into like a proactive annihilation in the next lane or something like that, then it's an amazing play. Initiative matters in Artifact. I don't know if you know that or not, but initiative is pretty important. So a card that grants you initiative and also cycles itself is going to be good. Next up we have Dimensional Portal. This is arguably one of the most powerful blue cards in the game. Despite being a common, it's just amazing. It sees play in aggressive blue decks. It sees play in controlling blue decks because it can stall by just putting a bunch of bodies in front of things. It loves Ogre Magi because it can keep potentially making copies of itself and then flooding the board. It is the reason you want to play blue in draft. Like, if I'm being honest, one of the #1 things that will dictate whether or not I'm playing blue in draft is how many dimensional portals I can draft. It's just that good. You're spending 4 mana to essentially get a 6/12 worth of stats on the board, and it's spread out, and again, it can be proactive, it can be reactive, it's just very versatile. It's an amazing card. So yes, this sees a lot of play in Constructed and a lot of play in draft, and it's gonna likely be that way for some time. Next up we have Fog of War. 4 mana, each enemy has a 50% chance of being disarmed this round. I have not seen this played very often. The few times I have seen it played, it was in draft. It's kind of like a Hail Mary panic button. And it's just not very good because, as you can imagine, nobody wants to coin flip and see whether or not they get value. So this has the potential to make it so that it's like a fog from Magic, where your enemy does nothing, deals no combat damage in a round. It also has the potential for you to spend 4 mana and do nothing if you fail on your coin flips. And even if it's not a complete, like, across the board fail, if you know the few key targets don't get disarmed, then this ends up feeling pretty bad. But because it's disarm, and that means it's one-sided, when this works, sometimes it works amazingly, because if you can disarm some key heroes or even just key creeps on the enemy side, your stuff will still deal damage to them. They will not return damage. So this has the potential to be like a one-sided board wipe in certain scenarios. That's probably why that 50% chance is there, just because if it was a one-sided, like every enemy is disarmed, it would have to cost a lot more than 4. So that being said, the inconsistency is the bane of this card, and as such it does not see a lot of play in Constructed or Draft. Next up we have Foresight. Really straightforward. 4 mana, draw 2 cards, and this sees play because it's really straightforward. This is card advantage. You spend 1 card, you get 2 cards. It does not do anything to impact the board directly, but in Constructed that matters a little bit less, especially in combo decks, again, where you're trying to find key pieces. That's the most popular place that this card was included, was in combo decks. But in draft, if you run 1 or 2 of these, it's not the end of the world, because sometimes, depending on how your draft goes, you can run out of cards. Like, you can blow through a bunch of cheap creeps very, very quickly and use up all your resources, and then having something to fall back on is nice. Also, there are plenty of times where you kind of have like a dead lane. Either you've already won the lane, or you maybe have a hero that's going to die anyway, And you can use this in those lanes and then kind of turn what would have been a negative into a positive just by digging deeper, giving yourself more resources when you would have been doing nothing else anyway. So you can use it in that regard as well. Does see play, really straightforward, not a lot to really discuss there. So next up we have Self-Sabotage, 4 mana. You modify 2 random cards in the opponent's hand with deal 6 damage to a random allied tower in any lane. This is this card is just all sorts of like silliness. So first of all, both you and the opponent know which cards get modified when this gets played, so it's not like it's a booby trap and they're sweating bullets about, am I going to trigger it? Like, they know which cards get modified. The only thing they don't know is which tower is going to take the damage when they play those cards. But when you factor in that, like, you have to spend 4 mana on this card and it does nothing to the board, and then your opponent knows which cards are hit, so if they want to, if they're really that afraid, they can just choose to not play those cards. And then even if they do play those cards, there's no guarantee that you're going to hit the towers that you're trying to rush, trying to target with the damage. This could just deal damage to the dead lane tower, if you will. This card's pretty bad. For all of the reasons I just said, you need so much to go your way to get any value out of this whatsoever that it's just not good. I have not seen it played in Constructed. I have seen it played in Draft, but not effectively. Just because I see people playing it doesn't mean that it's the right choice. I am not a fan of this card because there is way too much that needs to go in your favor to get any value whatsoever. Now, the exact opposite is true with Annihilation. Annihilation is one of, if not the best blue cards in the game. It is like the poster child for blue control. 6 mana, condemn all units. Now, this is condemn all units in a lane, so it's not like everything across every board, but this is the, like, panic button, the stall, the end-all be-all. It can be a source of generating a lot of gold as well. Yes, when you play this, it's going to kill your heroes and your stuff in that lane as well, but a lot of times what happens is you purposefully kind of like let a blue hero die, and then when it gets redeployed, you deploy that hero into a lane that is full and stacked. You grab yourself initiative, and then you pop Annihilation, and so yeah, you give your opponent 5 gold, but you nuke their entire lane and you get all of the gold as a result. It is a very big swing in tempo, usually a big swing in economics. As you know, we've talked about earlier, there's different kinds of resources, and there's this like in-game economy. Generating a bunch of gold for yourself can be really beneficial. But again, it stalls. Like, if your opponent pops Time of Triumph, great. You can use Annihilation and buy yourself some time. Your opponent has a big lane filled with stuff and they have the Oath there. Sweet. You can nuke it with Annihilation. It just is your reset button. It's very, very good. And it got even better when Cheating Death got nerfed. Cheating Death, the old version, used to be kind of the way you would try to play around Annihilation, but now there's not nearly as much. So, you know, it's basically the reason that blue rose in popularity after that balance patch. Annihilation will continue to be good in any meta where you don't want to die. So probably for a long time. Alright, so next up we have Call the Reserves. This is like Better Late Than Never on steroids. It's double the cost, double the effect. 6 mana, summon 2 melee creeps into any lane. And it's very, very similar, in my opinion, to Better Late Than Never, in that, you know, it gives you some versatility, gives you some cross-lane playability. Probably not something you want to, like, prioritize. I mean, this card isn't terrible, but, like, when you compare it on paper to something like Spring the Trap that costs 1 mana more, but you get 2 4/8s in red, this feels pretty lackluster, but, again, you know, creeps are bodies, and if you need a good filler card, if you need something at the top end of your curve, because blue doesn't have a lot there with regards to like playing like big meaty things at the top end of its curve, you know, it could be a good filler card for you in Draft. Doesn't see a lot of playing Constructed, but it has the potential to be a decent filler card in draft. So next up we have Friendly Fire. 6 mana, you choose 2 enemies and they battle each other. This card is actually pretty decent. It doesn't see a lot of play in Constructed simply because at 6 mana there are better options like Annihilation. But in draft, this card has the potential to be great. You could, with Initiative, for example, make the enemy have their 2 heroes fight each other, kill each other. You get the gold for that, and you've locked them out of playing cards for that lane if that was their only 2 heroes there. It is not position dependent. The 2 enemies don't have to be next to each other. They just have to be in the same lane. So this card is versatile, very, very good in draft. Specifically in draft because, again, you don't have access to, like, you're not running 3 Annihilations, 3 at any costs. You're not doing all those things that you would do in Constructed, but in draft, picking this up feels pretty good. Alright, Lost in Time. 6 mana, give 3 random cards an opponent's hand plus 3 lock. Earlier I was kind of talking about how lock cards didn't necessarily feel great. Of all of the ones that do exist, I think this is probably the best, simply because it is a long time. Like, plus 3 lock is a long time. You're basically saying, like, your opponent discarded 3 cards at this point, because if the game drags, if you're on mana turn 6 and you play this and the game drags on to the point where they're still getting to play those cards, then you were in a slugfest, right? But for the most part, like, it still doesn't see playing Constructed because, as I said, most people kind of figured out that the lock stuff was just delaying the inevitable, and it's also in that clutch 6 mana spot where you want to be playing Annihilation or Berserker's Call or something in that regard, something that affects the board. This does not. But in draft, where you don't have these big, splashy, flashy 6 mana plays all the time, it can be entirely reasonable to play Lost in Time and make your opponent feel really, really bad about not getting to play those cards for 3 more turns. So yeah, it is okay in draft. It's probably the best of the lock cards, but as I said before, the lock cards are kind of a personal preference thing. I'm not personally sold on them, but I have seen some other people get okay value out of it. Next up, we have Remote Detonation. This card is 6 mana and it deals 5 damage to each enemy across from an empty combat position. This does not see playing Constructed because, as you may have guessed, there's just better options, aka Annihilation. But in draft, I've actually had a lot of success with this. It's like a budget Annihilation a lot of times. If your opponent wins a lane and they start to go wild, or maybe they drop that Red Mist Pillager and they start to multiply, or whatever the case may be, they get this wide board. You can deploy your lone blue hero and then use Remote Detonation to nuke the majority of their board, thus slowing down either them hitting your tower or slowing down them racing your Ancient. And I have had a lot of success with it, I'm not gonna lie. I think it's a solid draft card to pick up, and it's not one that people play around very often because they're usually thinking about cards like Annihilation or like Thunderstorm that we're going to cover next, but it's been pretty successful for me in draft. Again, the big thing with draft is there's not a lot of like AoE, area of effect board clears, and so this is one of those, and it is beneficial if you can run it. So next up we have Thunderstorm, which is another AoE board clear. So this one is 6 mana and it deals 4 damage to each enemy. Pretty straightforward. So it doesn't care whether or not there's something across from it. Every enemy takes 4 damage. So not as much as Remote Detonation, but you guaranteed hit everything. And for the same reasons that Remote Detonation is good in draft, Thunderstorm is good. Thunderstorm probably not good enough to see playing Constructed because, again, you're already going to be running at any cost. You're already going to be running Annihilation, and then you're going to likely be running some additional stuff from the heroes you're including. So it might be a Luna, or it might be a Skywrath, whatever the case may be. So running something like Thunderstorm and Constructed ends up feeling pretty redundant. But in Draft, where there's not a lot of AoE board clears that are good or effective, this is a great choice. 4 is the magic number because this means that it'll kill melee creeps unless they've been buffed by something else, and that's a big deal. So Thunderstorm, very solid in Draft, very good pickup. And then the last blue spell to round things out is the Big Daddy Bolt of Damocles. 10 mana, deal 20 damage to the enemy tower. And this sees play. It sees play in Constructed, sees play in Draft. In Constructed, it's typically in blue-based control decks that are trying to draw the game out, and then they use this as a finisher. Bonus points, if you have a Incarnation of Salamene and an Ogre Magi out, and you can hit some multicasts, because then you can just chain them. But yeah, it's just a finisher. A lot of times 20 damage is more than enough to finish off a tower because of just incidental damage done throughout the course of a game. So it's really just stall till 10 mana, and then this likely finishes out a tower. And it's kind of the same thing in Draft. In Draft, it can be very effective because if you do manage to drag the game out to 10 mana, you will absolutely be killing a tower with this because of incidental damage that's been done throughout the course of the game. And so it's a great finisher, and it's immediate. Your opponent can't really stop it or interact with it. As long as you have initiative, you just start the turn, and then you win. You punch that tower as hard as you can, at least the hardest way that you can in the game right now with any spell, and that's Bolt of Damocles. So that rounds out the blue spells. If you made it this far, if you listened to all of my rambling, I sincerely appreciate it. I hope that this is beneficial for you, or at least somewhat insightful. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video.